Beis Avi. Okay, stay there. Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, what we're going to do tonight, and hopefully this will take us through a few weeks. I may give added shirim during the week and kind of share them with the chevra. I might just announce that we'll do them in person if anyone's interested. But this is a mimer. So each printout, every gilyon, has a Shal Shudas drasha. And very often the Shal Shudas drashas are either the last week's drasha, which gets edited by Rebbe Kiva and with footnotes that are added, or it's going to be that week's parsha, but from previous years, right? So we have probably the Rebbe started giving over Torah, Berudim in Taf Shin Sadi Dalid, Mashu Kazeh. What?
How many years ago is that?
Probably it's about 15 years ago, Mashu Kazeh. That's give or take. And the first published sefer was Tafshin Samech of Nishmas and Chadassin, not Nishmas and Chadassin, De'ei Chochma, which is the Shal Shudas drasha. So this week, we have already a nice, real collection of the Rebbe's Torahs, the Shal Shudas. Each year is a Mahalach B'fnei Atzmo. So what they printed this week just so happens to be Mitoich Divrei Elokim Chaim, Rava Deravin, Parshas VaYeitzeh, Tafshin Ayin Gimel. Now, this mimer was also printed in the Yam HaChochma Tafshin Ayin Dalid, because in Tafshin Ayin Dalid, what they would do, typically for a number of years, up until Tafshin Ayin Tes, with a few years in between, and hopefully what will continue afterwards, is that they would print yearbooks of the Rebbe's Torah. So it would be all the Mahalchim and the Hamshechim that the Rebbe would be giving over. It would also be the Masechta that the Rebbe was learning that year, B'Pnimius. It would be the Shulchan Aruch. It would be different Ma'amarim on Pnimius, Chasidus, V'Kabbalah. And so in Tafshin Ayin Dalid, they printed a few ma'amarim on Sipurei Maisios. The reason Sipurei Maisios from Rabbi Nachman were printed in Tafshin Ayin Dalid was because in Tafshin Ayin Gimel, which was a year that the Rebbe was specifically responding to certain things that were taking place historically at that moment, what or how. It could be that I knew at one point that I heard from a Talmud. I don't remember anymore exactly what was happening in Tafshin Ayin Gimel. It may have been associated with the Rebbe's return from Uman to be in Yerushalayim, and Uman should be Yerushalayim for Rosh Hashanah. That could be. I could be wrong on that though. But Tafshin Ayin Gimel, every mimer was a direct response to something that was taking place. Now, I was zeichet to hear from Rav Shmuel Ehrenfeld Shlita that most of the ma'amarim that the Rebbe gives are in response to something. They're coming to be mevayer something, some shita, some opinion, something in the oilamos. But this mimer from Parshas VaYeitzeh, Tafshin Ayin Gimel, which was also printed as a commentary on the sixth story in Likutei Moharan of the Maisa Mimelech Anav, the tale of the humble king, which L'Fiani Astaiti is one of the Makomos HaKadoshim Shebekadoshim within Sipurei Maisios Meshanim Kadmonios. I spoke to Rav Shmuel Ehrenfeld today, and I told him something about Sipurei Maisios, and what Rav Shmuel said was that every hasaga, every new chiddush that a person has, or any awareness that a person has in Sipurei Maisios, is kedai to be meshabeach and lahoidos el HaKadosh Baruch Hu ad ein sof. Why? And I said, why specifically Sipurei Maisios? And Rav Shmuel said, B'zeh Lashon, he said, because Sipurei Maisios Meshanim Kadmonios is the shorish of the Torah. Right, that the 13 tales of Rabbi Nachman, of Atik Yoimin, go to a place prior to Bereshis. And so this teaching in Parshas VaYeitzeh, again, to just express why I want to learn this mimer inside, so there's a tale that Rabbi Nachman wrote called Ma'aseh Mebitachon. Ma'aseh Mebitachon, a tale of trust. Something that I worked on for a number of years was a biur or a perish on Ma'aseh Mebitachon based on the Rebbe's Torah, because Ma'aseh Mebitachon is such a story that it gives value to the psychological experience that most people find themselves in. It speaks of absence, it speaks of not knowing what to do, it speaks of not having koyach, it speaks of finding oneself lost. And in Ma'aseh Mebitachon, a lot of the sugyos that come up are sugyos of emes and sheker, there's sugyos of pretending for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's sugyos of laughter for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then what I found in Parshas VaYeitzeh, Tafshin Ayin Gimel, was that the Rebbe gave a mimer. The Rebbe gave a mimer which touches upon so many of these yesodos. And I believe that this mimer from the Rebbe, a lot of what is said in here is in the darga. If it was not written, if it was not given over by the Rebbe, it would be nearly impossible to say such things. Because this mimer goes to what I believe, at least for myself, is mamish the very central point of Nikudas Halev in terms of what Avodas Hashem is. And it's a mimer that I've always loved. It's a mimer that I've always wanted to discuss and try and learn through. And then I was thinking about this mimer. So I had this old printout of the mimer, which Baruch Hashem I was able to find. But I couldn't find it, and this Shabbos I was wondering where it was, and then when I looked at the mimer that they had printed, it was Tafshin Ayin Gimel. So they printed Tafshin Ayin Gimel, Parshas VaYeitzeh this week, which is why, I'm taking it as a hakdama to be able to enter into it.
Which story is
Maisa Mebitachon is not in Sipurei Maisios Mishanim Kanmonios. It's in added stories and Mishalim that were given over either earlier or later. Maisa Mebitachon was given over the year that Rabbi Nachman started to tell Sipurei Maisios. So it was Taf Kuf Samach Vav, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, or Taf Kuf Samach Dalid. He said Maisa Mebitachon over in the beginning of Elul, and then he said it over again on Vav Elul. One of the few places that we have Mufurash that Rabbi Nachman repeated himself explicitly. He says, Oid Siparti Maisa. I told the story again. And Maisa Mebitachon is very much connected to the sixth story, which is the Maisa Mimelech Anav, which will, in the end, after learning this mimer, we'll bring it back into the Maisa itself.
Which story is it though?
Which story? So it's the story of the man with the fixer who fixing all of the broken things. Yeah, exactly. And he, in the end, he has a wooden sword, and instead of a metal sword, and he reveals to Hashem that he knows he has a wooden sword. He knows he's just pretending, but in the end of the day, he's going to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu anyway. So what we're going to do is look at a mimer, and what I want to try and do is go through the Hakdamos HaYesodos that are necessary. Look, any Torah that comes from the mouth of the tzaddik is koilel hakol. So each mimer, I believe, can be seen as the beginning, the middle, and the end. And a person can find whatever they need in a particular mimer. And you just have to look a little bit at what Hasidim used to say about the Divrei Torah that tzaddikim gave over in Rav D'Ravin at Shalosh Shadis. All the more so anybody who's been zeichet to be by the Rebbe for Shalosh Shadis and sees what goes on there. Just the Rebbe is just on a completely another wavelength. First falling asleep in his Pashtas Agashmias, opening his eyes after an hour, looking at Tosefta Yerushalmi with the Berudim of Rishonim, learning Sugyos and the Ritva, and then after the first Shalosh Shadis, there's a break, and then the Rebbe comes back out for the second Seder of Shalosh Shadis, which is some Nikudim and then the mimer, and the Rebbe covers his mouth during the mimer and is leaning back, mamish, ki'ilu, he's like on the floor lying down, and Rebbe Kiva Erlinger Shlita is sitting there kind of not listening to the mumbling and just typing word for word exactly what's happening. It's mamish, it's an incredible thing, and the Rebbe pauses in the middle of the Torah, and there's like an oy, there's a sigh that the Rebbe has, which is really like, it's clear that the Rebbe is being mamshich more Torah down. So each Torah is koilo hakol, especially when a person is willing to learn the mimer as if it were Torah Shabal Peh, meaning to understand the makoros upon which this mimer is based. So we'll begin. I'm not sure how far we'll get today, but what I want to try and do is I want to move through this mimer. So in the past I've done this with some Amarim from Yat Kislev of the Rebbe, and today we're going to do this with this, and we'll see how far we get, Be'ezras Hashem. So the pasuk that this mimer is coming on is in Parak Lamed Aleph, Psukim Yud Aleph and Yud Beis. Vayomer Elai Malach Elokim b'chaloim Yakov v'amar hineni. Vayomer Sana Einecha v'Rayas Kol Asudim ha'oila al Hatzon Akudim Nikudim uBerudim ki reisi es Kol Asher Lavan Asalach. So this is the Pegisha between Yakov and Lavan, the birthplace of Knesset Yisrael, the birthplace, the origin point of Klal Yisrael. And it's at this origin point which emerges specifically out of this business transaction, this pegisha, this trickery, so to speak, between Yaakov and Lavan and what sheep they're going to lay claim to. And ultimately what we find is that there's three types of sheep. There are sheep with skin or wool that looks Akudim, Nikudim, and Berudim. So these phrases, as we're going to see, which seem really insignificant in the context of the narrative of the Torah, Ki'ilu one can say such a thing, become not only a significant point in the Kabbalah of the Arizal, but they become the central point in the Kabbalah of the Arizal. Because ultimately, Akudim, Nikudim, and Berudim represents the three stages through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu begins to create the world towards the world that we live in as we experience it nowadays. And we're going to focus primarily on the world of Akudim. So, Akudim, what does it mean, Akudim? So Rashi says as follows: Mishunim b'makom akedasam. There was a shift or a transition in the place where they were tied, meaning the sheep were tied, their legs and the front legs and the back legs were held together. They were tied together. Kersula yedeihem v'ragleihem, right? There was a different color at the point in which the hands and the legs were tied together. And Berudim, what does Rashi say on Berudim? Chut shalavan makif es gufo saviv v'chabru broros elu psuchos u'mishulalos zu el zu. So what we're going to be focusing on ultimately is going to be Rashi on his parish in Ikudim. Now before we go into this, so what the Arizal is being masbir to us, b'derech klal, is the order in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself from the infinite light of Or Ein Sof Kavyachol, which annihilates and gets rid of any possibility of order or distinction or any levels. And once HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mitzamsem himself, and it makes a decision, Kavyachol, to create a reality for things other than godliness, that's where we begin to speak about these levels. Right? So prior to the tzimtzum, there's no discussion about levels. It's only after the tzimtzum that we begin to talk about the unfolding of all of the levels, which lead us down to this worldly place, and which we've discussed already in the name of the Taras Chacham. Every level of disintegration or distortion or concealment is simply another opportunity for us to recognize the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what the Arizal describes is that there are three stages. There's the world of Akudim, there's the world of Nikudim, and there's the world of Berudim. So what we're describing here is the process through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the world. But Derech Klal, what we know from the Rishonim, what we know from the Goinim, what we know from the Ramak, Rav Moshe Kordavar, Schusi Hagan Aleinu, and Pardes Yermonim, who compiled all of the different shitos, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to create the world by way of something referred to as Eser Spheros, 10 Spheros. Right? Keser, Chachma, Bina, Chesed, Gvur, Tferes, Netzach, Chod, Yisoid. If you're counting Keser, if you're not counting Keser, then it's Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvur, Tferes, Netzach, Chod, Yisoid. Now, B'derech Klal, these 10 Spheros can be seen in two different ways, especially in the Arizal. Either you see the Spheros as igulim, one in front of the other, one circle and then another circle, like layers of an onion, or what we see afterwards is the three-lined expression of the 10 Spheros, which is in the shape of a human being, or what we refer to as Adam Kadmon. That is going to be, right, you have the right line, which is going to be Chachma, the left line, which is going to be Bina, and the middle line, which is going to be Das. The right line, which is Chesed, the left line, which is Gevura, the middle line, which is going to be Tiferes, the right line, which is going to be Netzach, the left line, which is going to be Hod, the middle line, which is going to be Yesod, and then the bottom, which is Malchus. So those three lines of the 10 Spheros are referred to as Chachan, Baga, Dati. Chachan is the right side, moving from the top to the bottom, Chachma, Chesed, Netzach. Baga on the left side is Bina, Glura, Hod, and Dati in the middle is Das, Tiferes, Yesod, and then on the bottom you have Malchus. So you have these 10 Spheros. What we understand already, Mefurish in the Arizal, and Mefurish in the Ramak, and Mefurish in the Zohar Kadosh, is that these 10 Spheros express themselves in two different ways. There's something referred to as Oros and Kalim, lights and vessels. The entirety of existence, from the point of the tzimtzum and onwards, is all about Oros and Kalim, the proper relationship, the proper balance between lights, which represent the expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's essence from above to below, and the vessels, which are the containing elements that allow us to minimize and constrict that light so that we can have some sort of relationship to it. Because the reason the world couldn't have been created was Or Ein Sof. The light of the infinite was far too great, and there was no room for anything but the infinite. So the way that existence comes into being, so to speak, is through tzimtzum, through halbasha, through engarbment. Everything about the Arizal is teaching us, really, how the concealment of the light is ultimately that thing which allows us to experience the light. Without concealment, without kalim, we would have no access to the Or, and therefore there has to be a proper balance between Oros and Kalim in order for there to be an expression. In the stage of Akudim, and again, why did Hashem decide to do it through various stages? Is it because Hashem couldn't have figured it out in one stage? Chas v'shalom, everything that we see in the Arizal is with the basic awareness that Hashem has decided without any fathomable reason to create the world in such a way. When we talk about the language of the Arizal uses a language of mukhrach liot kacha. It has to be this way. All the Meforshim say it has to be this way. What are you talking about? No, it doesn't have to be this way. Hashem decided that this was the way it was going to be, and what we have is the Arizal as almost a Navi who's giving us an expression and an insight into what was happening. So to ask a question of why Akudim, Nikudim, and Berudim, why 3 stages instead of 2, why 3 instead of 1, so what the tzaddikim already point out is that if you start asking questions like that, it's not Kabbalah. It's not that; those are philosophical questions. Within the system of the tradition that we have klalim and pratim that are expressed to us, and it's not our job to ask why the klalim and the pratim are that way, because that happens through the unfathomable desire of the Ribono Shel Olam to manifest this way, as revealed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and to the Arizal, and to the Baal Shem Tov and to Rabbi Nachman and to all the tzaddikim. Our job is simply to try and understand deeply what's going on. So in the world of Akudim, what happens is as follows. Akudim is the first stage of expression. So I'm going to give a few hakdamos over here, Chavra, and I'm happy to clarify any of the hakdamos because I think this touches upon the very core of what we're trying to see from the Rebbe over here. So prior to the creation of the world, there was Or Ein Sof. There was infinite light that saturated all things. There was no room for anything else. So what HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided to do is Kad Salik Berusa in a Miver Alma, when it arose within his unfathomable desire to create a world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mitzamseim his Or to the Tzadin. Hashem made it tzimtzum and created some sense of a vacant space. Now, whether it was vacant or not is obviously up for discussion, but we know obviously that it wasn't really vacant. Nothing is absolutely vacant, but Hashem created an empty space, and in that empty space, HaKadosh Baruch Hu then re-entered his infinite light, so to speak, which is the kav of the Or Ein Sof. So prior to the tzimtzum, all there was unmeasured, unmitigated, unlimited, infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The tzimtzum is the willingness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, to create a space that appears to be devoid of his infinite light, so that something other than HaKadosh Baruch Hu could take shape. And then, once that empty space was there, Hashem returned a measured layer of his infinite light back into that void in the shape of a kav. Now, the kasha could be, how can you have a measured shape of infinite light? Doesn't infinite negate any concept of shape? That's the entire secret of everything, how the infinite and the finite merge together with neither kind of negating the other. But we'll take what the Arizal says at face value. The kav comes back down into the halal. So, Or Ein Sof, tzimtzum, kav comes back down into the halal. What happens with the kav, once the kav comes back down into the halal, there's the emergence of something referred to as Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon, very often referred to as Ak, Aleph Kuf. There were certain tzaddikim who wouldn't say the word Adam Kadmon because it was describing such a lofty level that it was almost as if saying something that was too holy to say. Not all tzaddikim felt that way. So Adam Kadmon is what fills and becomes the primary expression of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's light within the halal. Everybody with me? So why is it Adam Kadmon? Why is it in the shape of an Adam? Because ultimately the entire purpose of the Ribono Shel Olam's desire to create the world was so that human beings can grasp him. And human beings need to grasp something that they can understand. And therefore the mashal that HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates is this thing called Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon is the various layers of Spheros and the various layers of Partsufim that engarb the Kav. They become basically the garments of the infinite light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that descended back down into the Kav. We don't talk about really what's taking place inside of Adam Kadmon, as the Arizal describes. And again, meaning we can need years of introductions to not be magshim, but obviously everybody knows that we know these are just mishalim. Yes, they're real mishalim that took place in a certain way, as we discussed in previous shirim on the nature of Kabbalah Arizal, but they're pashut in a way that we have absolutely no idea. So never, God forbid, to ever assume that any of this is real or expressible in any of the ways that we assume expression can take place. Okay, so we're talking about invisible things that are still visible, or virtual realities, right? Things that are real, but not real in the way that we understand things to be real. So the only discussion happens with regards to the lights that come out of Adam Kadmon. So what the Arizal describes is as follows, that in the beginning, there were lights that came out of Adam Kadmon, And the lights that came out of Adam Kadmon, in order to be expressed externally, were 3 layers. We're talking about the lights of the Ozen, the lights of the Oznayim, the lights that came out of the ears of Adam Kadmon, so to speak, the lights of the Choitem, the lights that came out of the nose of Adam Kadmon, and then the Oires of the Peh that came out of Adam Kadmon. This is referred to as Achap. Achap stands for Oizen, ears, Choitem, which is nose, and Peh, which is mouth. Again, these are all mishalim that when misunderstood seem very strange, when understood become very much like sugyos and shas, that a person has to understand the details and the chakiros and every particular expression and all the different shitos and how all of the different shitos give birth to a better understanding of what the Ari was being masbir to us. We're going to leave aside the oznayim, which is beyond our discussion right now. We're going to leave aside the chaitem, which is also beyond our discussion right now. And we're going to talk about the oiris that were yotzeh from the peh of Adam Kadmon. Because the peh, the mouth of Adam Kadmon, so to speak, was the first emergence of the possibility of a kli. On the levels of Oznayim and Choitem, by the Rosh of Adam Kadmon, there's no concept of vessels. All we're talking about there at such a lofty level is absolute light in a full expression of light. And to begin to talk about vessels over there is to, God forbid, become mistaken and talk about limitation in a place where we're still dealing with the halachos of the unlimited. The peh, which very much like our own experience is the first place where we express ourselves. Sure, we experience life through our ears and through our nose, but we only express ourselves to another person outside of ourselves through the peh, through language. So the lights that came out of the peh of Adam Kadmon are referred to as Oros HaAkudim. Olam HaAkudim, the world of Akudim. Why? Because here it was the first emergence of a kli. It was the first beginning of a kli. But what happened was as follows. It was one kli with 10 lights inside of it. All of the 10 Spheros, all of the Keser, Chachma, Bina, Chesed, Gvur, Tferes, Netzach, Chod Yisod, all of the Partsufim that we're going to experience in the worlds of Atzilus, they express themselves all within one vessel in the world of Akudim. Meaning to say the unity was so clear in the world of Akudim that all of the different expressions of light, all of the different expressions of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Hanhaga and the way that he runs the world were all still very, very clearly rooted in an absolute sense of unity. The next stage is the world of Nikudim, where now it's 10 lights in 10 vessels. And here's where all of the vessels are demanding all of the light, and that's where we encounter Shviras HaKelim. Right? So first Akudim is one vessel with 10 lights. The next stage is Nikudim, which is going to be the light that comes out of the eyes of Adam Kadmon, so to speak. Again, we're passing over some of these concepts. And there's the Shviras HaKelim. Then the world of Berudim is what we refer to as the world of Tikkun, where there's a healthy balance.
Does this fit into the names of the...
Akudim, Nikudim, and Berudim? Absolutely. Akud, as we're going to see, Akud means it's like bounded. Nikudim means they're individualized without any balance. And Berudim, the Leshem Shavachaloma, and many of the Mefarshim try and understand what's unique about Berudim. So there's a way of reading Berudim as something that is kind of synthesized. But the Leshem has an interesting shita where he says Berudim is like Barad. And Barad is kind of this congealment and non-congealment. It's liquid and solid at the same time, which means it's Oros and Kalim at the same time. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam shakol nibro. And so, what we're focusing on primarily in this mimer is going to be the world of Akudim. Because in the world of Akudim, what we have, again, is one vessel with 10 different lights. As opposed to the world of Nikudim, which is 10 different vessels for 10 different lights.
If there's 10 vessels and 10 lights, it should be able to exist.
It should be able to exist. Right, that's what the Balatani asks. That brings us down. He says, wait a second. When we look in the world of Nikudim, which is the world of Shviras HaKelim, we know how Shviras HaKelim happens, right? All of the vessels, the vessel of Keser wanted all of the lights. Everybody, well, not the vessel of Keser, rather. The vessel of Chesed, Gvur, Tferes, Netzach, Chod Yisod, because the Shvira only takes place in the 7 lower Spheros. But the light of the Kli of Chesed wanted everything, and it shattered. The Kli of Gvur wanted everything, and it shattered. But the Balatani asks a question. Wait a second. If 10 vessels couldn't handle 10 lights and they shattered, Kal v'chomer by Akudim, there should have been a Shvira where it was only one vessel desiring one light, all 10 lights. And what the Rebbe points out in this mimer is that's the Chiddush of the world of Akudim, where it's an impossible unity, where it's such a delicate space where everything still exists exists in a state of unity, and it's the very beginningness of the potential towards disunity. And so in this lofty place, we're dealing with a different set of halachos, as we're going to see. But the Baal HaTanya asks the very same question. And so one last thing that we'll say about Akudim, which is going to be fundamental to the mimer, is going to be as follows. That Akudim... So just as a haktama, again, we're crossing over a lot, and Be'ez Hashem, we should be zocha to learn all of this, but the lights of Oiz and Choitem and Peh are referred to as the lights of Sag. Now here's another important introduction. Everything is dependent upon, contained within, and expressed through the four-letter name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yud, Kei, Vav, Kei. The Shem HaEtzem, which goes as high as one can possibly imagine. As long as we are capable of thinking, our mind is still attempting to attach itself to the Shem Havayah, even to the level of what is referred to in the Rishonim as a Shem Havayah B'li Osios. Right? A written name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu without any letters. Meaning to say, Shem Havayah, as the Emek HaMelech says, is what we have. It is the way that we refer to and the way that we grasp HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvaydu ba'atzma. We can never grasp HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'atzmusa, like we've spoken about all the time. We can never grasp the essence of God. The chiddush of the Torah, which is correspondent with the Shem Havayah, is that when I grab the Shem Havayah, I am grabbing the essence of God. How, why, in what way, it's impossible for me to ever understand, as the Baal HaTanya points out in the 4th chapter of Tanya, that when we're learning Torah, there's a yichud nifla, and I can say, I may have touched the clothing of the king, but I also touched the king by touching the clothing of the king. That's the Shem Havayah. There are 4 permutations of the Shem Havayah. Everybody with me? Now, there is, when you spell out the Shem Havayah, so Yud is always going to be spelled out, Yud, Vav, Dalid. And then, when it comes to Hey, and when it comes to Vav, there's 3 different ways, or 4 different ways to spell out those letters. The first name, correspondent with the highest level of the Shem Havayah, is referred to the Shem Havayah in the gematria of Ab, or 72. That is the Havayah b'milui Yudin. It's spelled out Yud Vav Dalid, Hey Yud, Vav Yud Vav, Hey Yud, which is the gematria of 72. That's correspondent to the world of Atzilus. That's correspondent to the Yud. That's correspondent to Chachma. Okay, then we have the Shem Havayah of Sag. This is correspondent to Bina. This is correspondent to the world of Bria. This is correspondent to the first Os Hey. We spell out Yud Vav Dalid, Hey Yud, so very similar to the first Shem. But then the Vav is spelled Vav Aleph Vav. Why is it spelled Vav Aleph Vav? Because Bina is the source of Zer Anpin, and that Aleph is going to express itself later on to be what we understand as ourselves, which is the Shem Havayah b'miloi Alfin, which is Gematria Ma. And then it's Hey Yud. So that Gematria of that second Shem Havayah is Sag. Then the third Shem Havayah, which corresponds to the Ois Vav of the Shem Havayah, corresponding to the world of Yitzira, the parts of Vav Zer Anpin, the Spheros of Chesed, Gvur, Tferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. That Shem Havayah is spelled out with Alfin. That is the Shem Ma, which is the gematria of Adam. That's Yud Vav Dalid, Hey Aleph, Vav Aleph Vav, and Hey Aleph. And then the last one, which is referred to as Maras HaMachpelah, because it's just the doubling of the name of Havayah, it's the Shem Ban, which is the gematria of 52, which is Yud Vav Dalid, and then it's just a Hey Hey, Vav Vav, Hey Hey. So the 4 Shemos of Havayah, which correspond each one to one of the letters of the Shem, is the Yud is the Shem Av, the Hey is the Shem Sag, the Vav is the Shem Ma, and the Hey is the Shem Ban.
Can be more options.
Bevadai. The Ramami Panau has a sefer, a conscious referred to as Sefer HaMiluyim, where I believe, I'm forgetting the number, but there's almost like there's 28, 29 potential permutations. But for the Ari, this became the fullest expression of the Seder Ashtalshalas, Avada. And so, because we're dealing with the Shem Sag, because we have no access to the Shem Av, Shem Av, which is the highest or, that's already dealing with the hair of Adam Kadmon. That's a place that's beyond our comprehension. It's the Shem Sag, which is the beginning of Oizen Choitem Peh. Again, this is not coincidental. It's not surprising that the entire system of the Arizal starts with the lights of Bina, because the entire process of the Arizal was to be Megala lights of Bina. The Arizal was Yitzchak, which is Shorish of Bina. The Arizal found himself in Mitzrayim, which is a Shorish of difficulty, and the light of Bina is the difficulty that gives gives birth to clarity. So the Arizal is beginning to talk to us on the level of Bina, which is why the first thing we talk about is the Shem Sag. So what we find by Akudim, and this is a remez that's going to be necessary, so we want to find a remez to the Shem of Sag, of Yud Vav Dalid, Hey Yud, Vav, Aleph Vav, Hey Yud, in Akudim. So what we have is that Sag, 63, plus the 22 letters of the Aleph Beis, which find their expression in the beginning within the Peh of Akudim, is the gematria of Peh. So we find is that the Olam Akudim is referred to as the Peh. It's the lights that come out of the Peh of Adam Kadmon. And clearly, just as the world of Akudim is the beginningness of a Kli or a vessel prior to disintegration or disunity, so too the letters, the Chaf Beis Osios, are rooted there. Because as the Baal Shem Tov taught us, the letters are everything. As the Baal Tanya reveals to us, as the Gra points out, as all of the Tzaddikim point out, the letters are everything. Everything is contained within and expressed through the osios that exists in each and everything. So the beginning of expression is not only the vessel of Akudim that contains the 10 Spheros within it, but it's also the source of those 22 letters within the mouth of Adam Kadmon.
But aren't the Osios rooted in the Machshava before the Dibor? So
Bevadai.
rooted in.
That's already going to be Chasidus, right? The Arizal is not discussing Oisius and Machshava, but in Lubavitch, in Chabad Lubavitch, it's the Mittler Rebbe's yahrzeit yesterday, and or today, it's still B'hamshacha. So in Lubavitch, you have tens and tens of gradations of Osios HaChakika, engraved letters, Osios HaMachshava, Osios Kodem HaMachshava, Osios Deratzon, Osios Dereshimu. But in the Ari, what we have is the beginning of the Osios are going to be expressed in Olam HaAkudim. Except what we're going to uncover, and the Rebbe is going to bring us to this, is that most of the Kabbalah that we have is from Rav Chaim Vital. Rav Chaim Vital was the main Talmud of the Arizal. Rav Chaim Vital made the rules, so to speak, because he was right to make the rules about what is considered the Kabbalah of the Arizal and what is not considered the Kabbalah of the Arizal. It was his son who did a lot of the editing, Rav Shmuel Vital, and created the Eitz Chaim Kadisha, Eitz Chaim. There are many klalim, there are many rules and regulations in terms of what is legitimate, because the Arizal had many Talmidim, but the Arizal singularly gave permission to Rav Chaim Vital to express these teachings. There was another Talmud. His name was Rav Yisrael Sarug, or Rav Yisrael Saruk, depending on whether you end it with a gimel or a kuf, who's known as a Talmud of the Arizal, who spread the teachings of the Arizal in Italy. He became the Rebbe of the Emek HaMelech, Rav Naftali Bacharach. He became a Rebbe of the Ramah Mipana, of Rav Yaakov Kappel. He describes teachings from the Arizal that Rav Chaim Vital does not describe. For Rav Chaim Vital, the highest world that we talk about is Adam Kadmon, and then you have Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Those all correspond to one Name Havayah. The Kutzel Shal Yud is Adam Kadmon, the highest level, correspondent to Keser. The Yud is Atzilus, correspondent to Chachma. The Hey is Bina, correspondent to Bina. The Vav is Yetzira, correspondent to Zer Anpin, and the Hey is Malchus, correspondent to Asiya, and that's the Shleimus. That's one Name Havayah. But Rav Yisrael Sarug, which the Hasidim and the Balei Lita made a big asek out of, and the Rashash learned it, and the Rebbe's Talmidim have ma'amarim about how it's considered, there's a lot of literature on it, writing on it, holy literature, about whether this was to be considered legitimate Kabbalah Arizal, but Sof Davar Kol Nishma, everybody, B'li Yotzim in a Klal, other than the Balasulam, which is also a different type of Shita, focus on the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarug. Mahari Sarug's Kabbalah speaks about a loftier place of the Osios, which is referred to as the Olam HaMalbush. The Olam HaMalbush, which comes before the world of Adam Kadmon, is referred to as the world of the Torah HaKaduma. Right? Chazal tell us that the Torah was Koidim Ha'olam Shnei Alfei Shanim. Right? It was 2,000 worlds, 2,000 years prior to the creation of the world. And that world of Olam HaMalbush is the world of letters. So we're going to see that in truth, the source of the letters in Akudim are going to be found in a loftier place as well. Again, I promise you, these klalim, these haktamos, are fundamental to trying to grasp a little bit of what the Rebbe is discussing. So let's go. Yeah. What? What? So the Chiddush, and the question you're asking, right? The question is, how can we be talking about osios, which represent limitation, which represent midos, which represent constriction, and measurement? How can one talk about those concepts prior to what we know of as the tzimtzum? So, first and foremost, the Balatanya was mishabeach Rav Chaim Vital for not talking begilui about these worlds. Why? Because of this very concept. Because what the Kabbalah of Maharisarug reveals is that, you thought there was nothing higher than the Or Ein Sof. Right? You thought that before the tzimtzum, that was HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'choyde v'atzmo. What the Kabbalah of Mahari Sarga is coming to say is that it's never HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'choyde v'atzmo. There's always gradational letters. It gets thinner and thinner and thinner to the point where it's almost impossible to begin to identify whether something is real or unreal, and it becomes something that's referred to as either Eser Spheros HaGenuzos b'ma'atzilan, or what the Rebbe describes as Metzias she'ena Metzias, a non-existent existence. But the Chiddush of Mahari Sarug's Kabbalah is teaching us that no matter how high along the rungs of spirituality you climb, you're always climbing. You're always finding that, what I thought was truly the infinite is still just a higher level of thinning out measurement up to and including that point where the mind is lost. So the Kabbalah of Olam HaMalbush teaches us that even what we thought was the highest point is not the highest point. The danger in that is then we're still talking in the worlds of Or Ein Sof Kavyachol, and to talk about limitation or the possibility of limitation in infinitude, if you don't have the wisdom of paradox to be able to tolerate that apparent discrepancy, so a person can, God forbid, come and apply dargin or limitations on levels where it's usser completely to talk about limitation. This is what the Ravid describes explicitly in his Hakdama to Sefer Yetzirah, which Rav Aaron Halevi Mishra brings down in his Hakdama to Sharei HaYichud VeHaMuna, that one who comes to apply limitation or levels within that which is unlimited or without level is already beginning to really create discrepancies in terms of their grasp of their Yichud, which is why the Balatanya praised Rav Chaim Vital for hiding these things, because it wasn't for everybody, but Chasidus and really everybody else. And the Leshem Shaveh Chaloma points out that Rav Chaim Vital clearly knew about these worlds, as he hints to them tens of places in the first Sha'arim of Eitz Chaim, but there's a reason that they weren't revealed in the same way that the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital was revealed. Right, the Rav Hillel Paratcher says as follows: Hashem Kel Rachum V'Chanan. There's two levels of Havayah. The lower level of Havayah is the Kabbalah of Rav Chaim Vital, the worlds of Adam Kadmon, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. The Havayah Koidem Habriya is referring to what? How do you have Havayah there? That's the world of Olam HaMalbush. Stay there. So the Rebbe says as follows. We're going to see.
Hashem is the same Hashem before a person sins, and Hashem is the same after a person.
V'vadai, same concept, right? We can see the tzimtzum there as the chait, right? The chisaron. So Hashem is the same prior to the tzimtzum as he is after the tzimtzum. So the Rebbe says as follows: Hine inyan Akudim, Nikudim, uBerudim. What is the concept of Akudim, Nikudim, and Berudim? Perish ha'arizal, same seder hishtalshlus ha'ilamos. These three levels which we encounter with Lavan and the sheep and Yakov Avinu is the birthplace, the emergence of the unfolding of all of the worlds. Why? Dibetchila koidem ha'atzilus haya adam Kadmon. Prior to the world of Atzilus, all there was a world of Adam Kadmon. Umimenu yatsu oireis oizen choitem v'peh. And from Adam Kadmon, the inner lights emerged from the ears, which were the oros that are referred to as Av Desag, or rather Sag Desag, then the oros of the Choitem, which are referred to as the Mad Desag, and then the oros of the Peh, which are referred to as the Ban Desag. Uba Peh De'ak, which is the origination of Olam HaAkudim, Husoid Olam HaAkudim. Okay, this is the secret of the bounded world, right? Again, 10 spheros bounded in one vessel. Ki hayu sham yud oirei shel Esther Spheros. There were 10 oros there. Ach kulam hayu akudim b'kli echad. But all of them were contained and bounded within one vessel. Kolomar, meaning to say, shahaya kli echad im eser shnasos kedeisa b'gemara menachos peizayin amud beis. That it was one vessel with 10 different gradations. Shnasos hayu behin, as it describes by the korbanos that were distinctions within one singular item. Right, so the world of Akudim is that it's a singular reality, but with distinctions within it. Ach kol hayud sfiros hayu keshurim va'akudim yachad. All of the yud sfiros at that stage of Akudim were all bounded and tied together. Ve'achar kach yatsa me'einayim da'adan Kadmon olam hanikudim. And why einayim is a lower level if it's higher than the ears? Well, it's a whole sugi in the Arizal, but we'll get there be'ezras Hashem when it's time. Right after the world of Akudim, the lights came out of the eyes of Adam Kadmon Kavyachal, which is referred to as the Olam HaNikudim, which is where there was Eser Kalim LaEser Spheros, like we said, there were 10 vessels and 10 lights within them, and they're called the Nikudim because they come from the aspect of the Shem Sag Da'ak, which is an aspect of Nikudos. And these Kalim Elu Hayu Shviras HaKalim. This is where Shviras HaKalim was. Besod Hazayin Malachim Shemisu Kiyadua. In the secret of the 7 malachim, the 7 kings of Edom who died, which represent the shattering of the vessels, which begins to be the birthplace of all of our reality as we know it. Ubekalim elu, and in these vessels of the world of Nikudim, which came after Akudim, hayashvir sakelim. Va'achar kach, and only afterwards, yatsa maha chadash me metzach da'ak. Afterwards, after the b'shas hatikun, the light, a new maha chadash, a new light that was able to enliven and elevate the shattered vessels, comes from the metzach, from the forehead of Adam Kadmon, which is the place of Ravad Ravan, which is why you see tzaddikim very often when they're talking, they'll have their hand rubbing their forehead. The Rebbe talks about this a lot because the forehead is the place of Ravad Ravan. It's the place of that desire, the metzach haratzon, where a person is stuck within their own minds in a state of desire. So what we have is the olam ha'akudim, which comes out of the mouth, then you have the oiros and akudim, which come out of the eyes, where the shvira takes place, and then the oiros of tikkun, which come out of the meitzach, which come to rectify those broken vessels to create the world of tikkun. Again, we're rushing through these saktamos. All of these saktamos deserve decades. They deserve years, because when you go through the Kabbalah of the Arizal, and then you could find it in the Ramak, and then you go through the Meforshim and the Rashash, and then you go through Chassidus and the Gra, it's mamish ein sof. Just as the content matter is ein sof, so too the container which conveys the content matter is Ein Sof, which is why ultimately what the Leshem tells us is that the Iker Tikkun in Limud HaKabbalah is what? Limud HaKabbalah. Right? Because what you're engaged in as you're learning these things and discussing these concepts is you're accessing them with your mind through the Hamshach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu into your mind. You're thinking about these concepts and it gives you that chayus and the neshama of the concepts you're discussing. The light came out from the forehead of Adam Kadmon and it rectified the shira. And that gives us what Olam Ha'atzilus is, which is what we understand as a world of lights and vessels together, and that's referred to as Olam HaBerudim. Nimtza. So what it turns out is that the Gimel Sugei Hason, the 3 forms of sheep that we encounter with Yakov and Lavan, Shaya Yakov Avinu, Shem Akudim, Nikudim, and Berudim, these sheep that Yakov Avinu was dealing with, Heim Sod Gimel Bechinos Olamos. In truth, what it's describing is the 3 stages in the unfolding of reality, the 3 stages in the unfolding of the worlds, Shem Olam HaAkudim, which is the world of Akudim, the world of Nikudim, and the world of Berudim. V'zehu Sha'amar, and this is what the pasuk means when it says, Ki ra'isi es kol asher Lavan oisalacha. I have seen everything that Lavan has done to you. Zakta Arizal, something amazing. What is Lavan, right? If Akudim and Nikudim and Berudim, all of this, confusion with regards to the sheep are coming from this Pegisha with Lavan, but here the Arizal is telling us that Akudim, Nikudim, and Berudim represent the loftiest sources of all worlds. So Zakta Ari, Lavan is the sod of Luban Ha'elyon, the elevated transcendent space of pure whiteness, prior to any distinction, prior to any distortion. That is referred to as the Luban Ha'elyon da Adam Kadmon, Shemimenu Nimshachu Alamos Elu. Zak the Leshem already in his Perush on Eitz Chaim on this. How could it be? How could it be that Lavan Ha'arami becomes the Luban Ha'elyon? Elama. What the Torah is representing to us is that everything, when you bring it back to its truest source, when you climb back the ladder from effect back to cause, and then to realize that the cause was a previous effect of a previous cause and a previous effect of a previous cause, you climb all the way back and you come to find that there's nothing but the Luban Ha'elyon. Time, somebody?
9:44.
Okay, we'll go a little bit weiter.
So it's still very complex seeing how we could use the arch character of Ramah for the highest concept.
Sure. Adarabba, but what we find is that when a person has a klal gadol of ein oin mavado, then even what we refer to as sitra achra, if understood properly, is seen as simply the other side of yichud. The biggest klal gadol is that there's no shnius ever. There's no duality. Everything is part and parcel of Light HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Does that apply lahalacha when things emerge down through all of the gradations of gross manifestation and physicality and coagulation towards the Gimel Klipas Atameos? No. If I start looking at Gimel Klipas Atameos and say, oh, there's Elokus in here, so I'm a choit at that moment. But it doesn't mean there's no nitzatz of Elokus that's machaya everything. Right? There's no shnios. It has to be avada, pshiti, lama likra. Then it just becomes the halachos of how do I access it, how can I talk about it, and how do I relate to it from a perspective of human consciousness. But the klal gadol here is that everything, b'li yotzim and a klal, is expressive of Kudsha Baruch Hu. The tzimtzum is the highest level of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's revelation. It's the first revelation. Tzimtzum is removal, elama. Once we see it within the concept of Kedusha, so then we have to properly understand it. The Leshem addresses this very, very, very clearly. The Mittler Rebbe as well. In his drushim on this week's Parshios of VaYeitzeh and VaYishlach, nobody like the Mittler Rebbe spoke about a concept called Oiris de Tohu B'Kelim de Tikkun, the lights of chaos within the vessels of rectification. And the secret of how really Esav's expression is on a certain level and on many levels a higher expression than the expression of Yakov Avinu. Because Yakov Avinu is in Midos. Yakov Avinu is measured and ordered. But in truth, the chaotic lights of Esav represent the loftier ideal. It's Esav. Okay, so it represents a lofty ideal that needs to be understood properly. And we have to draw the lights of Esav into the vessels of Yaakov, which is the concept of Oirus Tatohu B'Kelim D'Tikkun. But you find this expressed everywhere, right? How could it be that there's an Aryeh on the Merkava? An Aryeh is a behemoth tameya. Elama, everything in its source can be elevated back up. So the Rebbe continues and he says as follows: V'zehu perish Rashi. This is what Rashi understands when it comes to the world of Nikudim. What does Rashi say? Shahayu mishunim b'makom akedasam shehem karsule yadayim v'raglayim. Right, again, we're talking about the front two legs of the sheep, which are referred to as the yadayim, and the back two legs of the sheep, which are referred to as the raglayim. We see that in the world of the Akudim, they were tied up together. So we see that for Rashi, the description of the world of Akudim is the secret of the hands and the legs being tied together. What the Rebbe is going to point out is something incredible which can open up into infinite different places, but the Yadayim represent Chesed, Gvura, and Teferes. They represent the Midos, and the Raglayim represent Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, which represent the inbred kind of tendencies that we have, the habitual states that we find ourselves in. And in the world of Akudim, they were not only not in opposition to one another, but they were unified together, like we find by David HaMelech, who represents also, as we're going to see, the world of Akudim, that he was able to walk mindlessly and say, wherever I'm going is where HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants me to go, because he got to a place where he realized that his emotional proclivities and his kind of inbred tendencies and habits were both expressive of the desire of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Zeu Perish Rashi, this is where Rashi says, Akudim hayu mishunim b'makom akedasam shem karsule yadayim v'raglayim. That the Akudim were different, or the distinction was by the point in which their legs and their hands were tied together. Dahainu, shahayu b'chinas hachagas shehem hayadayim, chesed and gvura teferes, emotional expression represented by the yadayim, the sixth beggar in the tale of Rabbi Nachman's tale of seven beggars, and the nahi, which are the raglayim, which is the seventh beggar in the tale of Rabbi Nachman's tale of seven beggars, who is the beggar without legs, which is the habituated tendencies without bechira. In the world of Akudim, they were tied together. V'hine ba'olam ha'nikudim, in the world of Nikudim, where the shvira took place, shebo hayu asara kelim na'aseh hashvira. The shattering took place. Why? Because lo haya hakelim yicholim lispol ha'oros. In the world of Akudim, we see that there's a shattering that takes place because the vessels are not strong enough to contain the oiris. And here's your question, right? V'hikshar b'no balatanya. Balatani asks in the Kutei Torah in Parshas Emor, Im b'nikudim shahiyarubai kelim. If in the world of Nikudim, where there were 10 vessels for 10 lights, hayashvira, there was a shattering because the vessels couldn't contain the lights. Eich ba'olam hanikudim shekol ha'oros hayu b'kli echad lo hayashvira. How could it be that in a world of Akudim, where there was only one vessel with 10 lights, kavachomer, there should be a shvira there? V'hainu. So the Rebbe continues, Shahakli hayayachol lispol kol hayud oros v'lo lishaber. That in Akudim, one vessel was able to contain 10 lights and not shatter. U'l'chayra yoiter hayatzarech lishaber kivan shayirak li echad. But l'chayra, it should have shattered much more than the 10 vessels in Olam Akudim, because there you had 10 vessels for 10 lights and it shattered. Here you have one vessel for 10 lights and it doesn't shatter. How is it possible that Kli Echad was able to be soivel all of the oros of the Yud Spheros? We're going to go one more paragraph towards an introduction, and then what I'm hopefully going to do is I hope to be able to give the next year on this kind of tomorrow night, because I want to be mamshech on this. And so, V'hine Kasav HaRamah Mipanau. Now, the Ramah Mipanau was one of the most significant Mikubalim that we've had, one of the most incredibly invigorating forms of Torah. By the Ramah Mipanau, there was no distinction between Torah Sanigla and Torah Sanister. It was a complete shiluv. When you learn the Kabbalah of the Ramah Mipanau in his Mamarim, in Yonas Ilaim, what you find is all of the shitos of the Arizal and the Mikubalim find expression in language of Chazal. Right, different Spheros, different shitos, not only Agadata, but you find that there's a complete and utter shiluv between Torah Sanigla and Torah Sanister. The Ramah Mipanau was somebody who was considered a Talmud of Mahari Sarug. He lived in Italy. He was really kind of like royalty. He was majestic in terms of his Torah teaching. There was a little bit of machlokas about the Ramah Mipanau, because some claim that he didn't have a beard, but what the Rebbe brings down from Rav Shlomo Babaver is that I know bevados that the Ramah Mipanau had a beard. And Zak the Rebbe, how did he know? Because when he's learning the Ramah Mipanau, it's ke'ilu Bal Hashmua Oimed Kenegdo, like the tzaddik is standing in front of him, and he saw beferish that he had a beard. So that's
Chabad didn't want beard, right?
What?
The Chabad didn't want beard.
The Chaban, yeah, but that's different in Yanim, I think. Right, I mean, yeah, obviously each tzaddik, Rav Sraya Deblitsky, right, different tzaddikim had different Yanim, but the Ramah Mipanau, back then, without understanding the context, the tzaddikim wanted to clarify, because it was also something the Maskilim wanted to claim as well. The Ramah Mipanau writes as follows, and this is brought where? This is brought in Hagos and Berudim on the Eitz Chaim. There, in the traditional editions of Eitz Chaim, there's something called Hagos and Berudim, which were developed by somebody named Rav Menachem Mendel Halpern from Yerushalayim, who was a Talmud Chaver of the Leshem. He was close with different tzaddikim, a tremendous goyin, very, very significant role in the transmission of Kabbalah Sa'arizal. So, Zak the Ramah Mipanau, Sha'adam Hagadol Ba'anakim. The pasuk in Yoshua says that there is a person who is great amongst the giants, Ze Avram Avinu. Kamoisha Amru Chazal, like Chazal told us, that Avram Avinu was shaykh to the giants. That is the bechina of Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon represents Avram Avinu. Okay? It's associated with Avram Avinu. So that expression that fills the halal is the light of Avram Avinu. Shehu nikra Adam Gadol Ba'anakim. The Achrav by Yitzchak Avinu, Shu Keneged Olam HaIkudim. Yitzchak Avinu corresponds to the world of Akudim, which we just discussed, which is 10 lights in one vessel. The Achrav Yakov Avinu, Shu Keneged Olam HaNikudim Berudim. And Yakov Avinu is connected the Nikudim and Berudim. Why does Yakov get two? First off, Yakov married Leah and Rachel. Yakov is always 6 and 6. But Nikudim and Berudim are not two separate things, but two stages of one singular thing. Shvira and Tikkun, shattering and building, it's very important, klal, are not two different things or expressions. They're one expression that takes place in two stages. The Shvira itself becomes the source of the Tikkun. It's not like there was something broken and then we had to get rid of all the brokenness and bring in something fixed. Ella, the broken thing becomes the fixed thing. So Avram Avinu is Adam Kadmon.
Names also.
Well, he has two different names as well, right? Absolutely.
Maybe those are stages.
Bevadai. And so what we see is that Avram Avinu corresponds to Adam Kadmon, Yitzchak Avinu corresponds to what? Corresponds to Olam HaNikudim, and Yaakov Avinu corresponds to Nikudim and Berudim. Shu Olam HaAtzilas, K'moshe Kasav HaArizal, Shu Olam HaAtzilas Nikra Yaakov. V'zeu Sh'amar HaKasav, Ki Ra'isi, Es Koil Asher Lavan Oisalach, I've seen everything Lavan has done to you, Shu Luvan Elyon, which represents that lofty place, Shu Asher Asa Kol HaMadregos Elu Shel Akudim, Nikudim and Berudim. Hashem is saying, I have seen the emergence of all of the worlds. What we're going to pause with over here is that this darga that we're going to be talking about, this darga of Akudim, this darga where there's only one vessel with 10 lights in it, this incomprehensibility of how it could be that one vessel can hold 10 lights is correspondent to the light of Yitzchak Avinu. Yitzchak Avinu, that tzaddik, that Av, who we spoke about, who represents paradox, who's both alive and dead at the same time, who represents the simcha that comes from dinim and the simcha that comes from gvuros. And so what we've set up for ourselves, Be'ezras Hashem, is the world of Akudim and the association with Yitzchak Avinu and the world of Akudim. So Be'ezras Hashem, I'll send out kind of a message when we'll do the next year. If there are chevra who are interested in doing it in person, Hareza Meshubach. If not, then we can then we'll continue online either way. Be'ezras Hashem.
Well, you're not going to carry on these Christmas shiurim?
What?
You're not going to carry on these shiurim on Sunday night?
I'm going to always carry on the shiurim on Sunday night, Be'ezras Hashem, but I don't want to wait. I don't want to wait to do this over 7 weeks. So I want to try and move through this mimer. Okay, so I want to move through the mimer because I think that by learning a mimer inside and seeing it as a hemshech instead of seeing it as one particular point, which we typically do on these nights, so then it's a different way of experiencing the Rebbe's Torah. So it's not going to be ma'akev one or the other. By next Sunday night, Mirz Hashem will do a different nikuda, but within the period of the next 7 days, somehow, I want to be mamshech this. Mirz Hashem.